Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the city of Forest Grove. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight, whether you're watching on our YouTube channel or on Facebook. We are very pleased to have Steph Littlebird here tonight to talk about a lot of things, actually. She's going to be talking about her involvement with This is Kalapuyan Land, the exhibit that has been up since 2020 at Five Oaks Museum. I'm just going to be talking about a lot of things. So this will be a really, I think, fascinating opportunity and learning journey for you all tonight. Before we get started, just a couple of things. I first of all want to acknowledge Five Oaks. Their institutional support has been tremendous, not only in connecting us with Steph and allowing her to be here with us tonight, but also in helping to facilitate a connection with our great partners at Pacific University, who are displaying 11 of the panels from the This is Kalapuyan Land exhibit, the traveling exhibit, and that'll be on display in the Tran Library on the Pacific University campus through the end of November as part of Native American Heritage Month. So definitely check those out. They're amazing panels. You get up close, you can read everything. You're gonna hear a lot about what Steph did when she curated that exhibit, and I think seeing that and listening tonight will just make that a richer experience. I'm right now in Hillsboro, Oregon, but I work in Forest Grove, and both cities are located on the colonized lands of the Aftalati Kalapuyans, who are also known as the Tualatin Band of Kalapuyans, who were the first inhabitants of Washington County. Today, their descendants are members of the Grande Ronde and Siletz tribes, and they uphold the traditions and cultures of their ancestors. I hope you'll join me in acknowledging and expressing gratitude for the ancestors of this place and recognizing that we are here today because of the sacrifices that were forced upon them. As part of honoring that legacy, their lives, and their continuation in our communities, I encourage you to spend time to learn more about the rich history of Indigenous peoples in the region and also in the United States. So our guest tonight, Steph Littlebird, is an Indigenous artist, writer, curator, and member of Oregon's Confederated Tribes of Grande Ronde. Her work combines traditional aesthetics with contemporary materials and subject matter to forge connections between our collective past and the imminent future. Steph was a recent fellow of the Association of Independent Colleges of Art and Design and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And she received national recognition in 2020 as curator of This is Kalapuyan Land, an exhibition that is at the Five Oaks Museum in Portland, which was featured by ArtNews and PBS NewsHour. And she also has, which we maybe can talk about a little bit later, another line to add to her accomplishments as being an illustrator of a kid's book. So we have time, we can talk about that later. And Steph lives in Las Vegas. So I'm going to bring Steph into the stream. Hi, good evening, Steph.
Good evening. So I can't see anyone who else is in the room, but good evening to everyone else who is here with us this evening.
Yeah. So the one thing about live streaming is, unlike Zoom, you don't see people. You don't see heads staring back at you. They're there. Believe me, they're there. And in fact, if you all want to pop something in the comments box, that would be great. This is totally interactive. So if you have questions or comments at any point tonight, please feel free to pop them in the comment box, and we can get to them at the end of the program. I just need to make a quick apology. I'm getting over a cold and I have a lingering and unpredictable cough. So I'm going to try to limit the amount of time I talk because it's annoying. But I'm well armed with Ricola and tea, so I should be okay. Steph, do you have a presentation that you want to put up on screen?
Yeah, actually, give me 1 second here.
Yeah, sure.
We'll hit present.
This is always the fun part for audiences, is seeing this kind of behind the scenes
I know, right? The
stuff.
the very exciting details. Okay, here we go.
Right.
All right. And you should see This is Kalapuyan Land on your screen.
Yes.
All right,
Now,
great.
now, when I add you to the stream, you won't see anything but this. So don't worry. So there we are. And I'm going to remove myself from the stream, and then I'll come back in when you're done. If you can give me just a little heads up when you're on your way to finishing, and we'll pop back in for the next segment. Now, I'll
Awesome.
turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone who is here this evening. I appreciate that people take time out of their day to learn about these things, and hopefully you'll find that, informative, but also interesting. So we tried to give you a good mix of history, but also talk a little bit about Indigenous art throughout. So it'll break it up, and it hopefully won't be, just a onslaught of history. So yes, we are talking today about This is Kalapuyan Land, the show, but also the idea, because much of the Willamette Valley is Kalapuyan land. There are different bands and tribes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But let me just move forward here. Before I get into the show, I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about the Five Oaks Museum and how this project came about. So originally the Five Oaks Museum was known as the Washington County Museum, and it actually used to be in Hillsborough. And when it moved to the PCC Rock Creek campus, shortly thereafter there was a bit of a administration change, and I think at that point the museum sort of decided to go in a different direction. It had originally been sort of built as a celebration of pioneer history of the Oregon Trail, and much of the repository of objects that the museum holds, which there are over 100,000 objects from what I understand in their massive archives, is generally related to that era of pioneering and the homesteading of Oregon. And so there's also within that collection of objects many Native American objects, including from my tribe and other local tribes in the area. So Five Oaks is a really special place in that it has a pretty cool collection of objects from different times throughout Oregon's history. But originally the museum was sort of, celebrating pioneer history more than anything, and, didn't give a whole lot of space to the Indigenous history of that land, of this, of Oregon. So when they changed their direction, they changed their name to the Five Oaks Museum, which is actually in reference to a historical site that's right off the Brookwood and Highway 26 exit. And it's basically one of the last public oak savannas in Oregon. The rest of them are either gone or there are some in some reserves, but the oak savanna is basically like a human engineered landscape. Natives used to engineer oak savannas. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So that's what Five Oaks is named for. It's actually named for a place of gathering that was home to gathering for both Indigenous people, but also eventually for Oregon settlers. So it holds a special place in many people's memories of the land. So Five Oaks is really trying to balance that and make sure that the stories that it tells are representative of the entire community. And that direction has really made them a notable institution in the region and also nationally. So they've had quite a bit of attention for their programming, and they're getting ready to reopen here soon. So I'm really looking forward to the stuff that they will offer the community in the future as well. So let me move forward to my next slide. So originally this show actually opened in 2019, and actually it closed unfortunately early due to the pandemic, and it was within the museum. You can kind of see there in the first image of the exhibition, your sort of standard gallery experience. The difference is that the historical part of it, the panels that would have, the very much museum presentation of information, it actually existed previous to me coming to the museum. And when the directors took over and decided to change the direction of the museum, they basically figured out that this exhibition, which was called This Kalapuyan Land, was the favorite, and that people would come just to visit and see that exhibition. Many of people were not really interested in the pioneer stuff. So they brought me in to look at this pre-existing exhibition and say, is it something that we should continue to display? Does it have, problems? What should we do with it? I think that they, basically they were wondering if they should put it in a dumpster and start from scratch. And when I came in and looked at the panels, I could see that there was accurate information, but there were also embedded biases within that information. And so I actually went through and edited the panels by hand with a red Sharpie. And as mentioned in my bio, I'm a writer. So I approached it as like a teacher editing a student's paper, and actually went through the panels in collaboration with our tribal historian at Grande Ronde, David Lewis. He's a tribal member, but he's also one of the world's foremost experts on Pacific Northwest tribal history. And so we went through the panels together and actually edited them, because the museum, when they originally created them, did not engage with the tribes. They just made them on their own. And so we had to go through and make some pretty substantial corrections to those, and also look critically at how information is presented. And I'll show you a little bit more of that as we go. But aside from all of this historical information, one thing that natives are always sort of combating is the idea of existing in the now. Many people think that we exist in the past, but we aren't actual people here in in the living. So part of the show also had to be presenting artwork, because that helps people to understand that we are still here and that we're in their community, and we are your neighbors and your friends, and we are artists and all kinds of creatives of all types. So this show was not only about history, but about sharing the resilience of the Indigenous community as it is today. Oregon has actually, Portland has the 9th largest urban Indian population in the country. So Portland is an extremely diverse Indigenous community. And so I wanted to make sure that that was represented, and that people could feel the presence of contemporary natives in with all of the history. So once the exhibition closed down, we actually sort of started to turn it into different things. So we opened it as like an online exhibition that you can access by going to the Five Oaks website, and you can look at all the high definition images of the panels if you can't get to the actual exhibition at the library at the Pacific University. And then we also created a yard sign exhibition called Museum at Our Place. And we wanted people to just be able to access this information on Kalapuyan land, and it could be outside of the museum and not be limited to that space. And what's really cool is that I did not come up with this idea. This is something that the museum came up with. And the response that we've had for it is crazy. Both OSU and U of O have hosted their own yard sign exhibitions in just the last year. And just a bunch of communities around Portland and in the Tualatin Valley have hosted these. And so it's really cool to see, smaller communities engage in this and be interested in history and in art at the same time. So yeah, it's been really neat. It's sort of evolved over time. And now we are actually preparing to reopen the exhibition with all new artwork at Pittock Mansion in February of next year. So we are working on that right now, and it will be open February through July. So if you've needed a reason to go to Pittock, there is your reason, because it will be a great show and an opportunity for you to see the original panels that I edited up close and personal. So if you don't make it to the one in Pacific at Pacific University. Okay, so this presentation was actually originally created for someone else to present, but you guys are lucky that I get to present it to you. So there is a quote for me on here that's going to make me feel like I'm talking in the third person, but I'm going to read just a little bit of it so that you can get an idea of how we came to the title and, why it was important for me to make these edits in the panels. So let's see, I've sort of explained a little bit about how I looked at the untouched versions of the panels, and then thinking about the original title of the exhibition, This Kalapuyan Land, I changed it to This Is. And that's because I felt like the original title was weird sounding. And so here's the quote a little bit to give you some context. The subtlety of words can actually create a mythology in a way. So when we say this Kalapuya land, there's a sort of disembodiment that happens with that language. Like, what does that mean? Whereas is very much now. It is currently our land, and it has always been our land. So it is a land acknowledgement built into the title as well. And as I go on to talk in this quote about editing, I think about approaching this not only as like an artist or a curator, but much of this history is personal, right? So my approach to this work would be very different than many curators would normally approach work in a museum, because this is personal history. It's not just any history, it's my own family's history. So for me, when I'm looking at these panels, I see my family, I see my family history, I see the things that have happened not only to my family, but to the people in our community and to the people in our community and continue to. So for me, it's important to emphasize that while these things have happened in the past, they actually continue to influence our daily lives in many ways. And so as you will see, part of the history that we share in this exhibition relates to what were called Indian boarding schools. And that is where Native children were forcibly taken from their families and basically taught skills that they could use to be useful agents in capitalism. And so that history has a lot of really painful elements to it that unfortunately have impacted the generations after it. And so I'll get a little bit more into that as we go. But for me, this history is very personal. And, so when I talk about it, I'm talking about it not only as just looking back at the past, but as something that very much impacts my day-to-day life and the day-to-day lives of many of my family members and my extended relatives in the tribe. So that's how important it is when we talk about it. So one of the very first panels that I edited was this sort of generic map of the region, which includes Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And again, the subtle language changes you'll kind of see throughout the exhibition. This one in particular, on the title of the panels, it said Indian Tribes and Languages of the Old Oregon Country. As you can see, I crossed out Indian and also the word old, because natives are constantly fighting this idea that we don't exist anymore. A perfect example is growing up in Oregon. I went to Banks School District K through 12, and in my history education, I learned that my tribe, the Kalapuyas, were extinct. And I knew that wasn't true when I was in class because I was a Kalapuya. So it was very confusing for me, but it also kind of it points to that thing which natives have to fight a lot, which is this idea that we're gone, that we were either genocided or assimilated out of existence. And so taking away words like old and thinking about how Oregon still exists and natives still exist. So that country is still ours and isn't old. It remains. Also, the word Indian is not something that natives really want non-natives to use as a term to talk about us. So that was another reason that I tried to call attention to the language that is sort of cavalierly used throughout this exhibition in referring to Indigenous people. And so when we zoom in on the map, it's really cool because you get to see all of the different locations that sort of Kalapuyans have lived in the Willamette Valley. It goes all the way, like I said, Eugene, Corvallis. We have, the Santiam down there. And then we have Mary's River. And also the Tualatin or Otfalati, which is the tribe that I belong to. And our our territory stretched all the way from Gaston out to Portland. So it really just depended on what time of the year you could find us at different places. So, Oregon is a very diverse Indigenous population now, but always has been. And, within this map, it's always good to remember that it's not all inclusive. And so I try to put this in context for people who don't know, but the Confederated Tribes of Grande Ronde is a confederation of nearly 30 bands and tribes. So it's not just one tribe. There isn't a tribe of Grande Ronde. There isn't any tribe that ever lived in Grande Ronde. That just happens to be where they chose to put us. And so our tribes also include tribes from Northern California at Grande Ronde. So it tells you how far some people were moved from their traditional homelands in order to be sort of under the control of the federal government. So, or U.S. government at that time. Okay, so, and another zoom in here just so you can see a little bit of that editing in the language. And then also you can see up here right above it where it says Willamette, just so you know. I used to get this question a lot when I was younger, which was people would ask me what Willamette meant, or the Willamette Valley, and I would always be told that it meant the Valley of Death. And I can assure you that is not what it means. And Willamette actually is just like the Frenchified version of the Kalapuyan word, which is Willamette or Willamette. And it means water spilling over or to spill water. And so when we think about the Willamette Falls, that makes a lot of sense because the Willamette Falls used to be the largest waterfall on the West Coast before it was turned into a paper mill. So it makes sense that we would call it that because that is what was happening there. So anyway, when people think about the Willamette, I hope that they think of the beautiful water features the valley has to offer, as opposed to it being the Valley of Death. So I appreciate an opportunity to dispel that myth when I can. So just before we get into the next bit of history, I wanted to pause and share one of my favorite pieces that was part of the original exhibition. This is called The Sun Bathed Everything by Angelica Trimble Yanu. And she is Oglala Lakota. And her work is really just incredible in terms of its visuality. It is very much in reference to the land and elements, and as you'll see throughout this presentation, that natives very much their identity is rooted in the land and where they come from. And so we have what's called place-based identity. And Angelica's work is very much about where her tribe comes from and the landscape that it comes from. And so when we look at this piece, which is, it's actually a print, it's called a monotype. And she is a printmaker. And what's cool is that every print that she makes is unique because they're a monotype. It means there's only one. And so this piece it's unique in that it's, again, abstract but evocative of the landscape. And I will also show you a quote from her and where she kind of talks about what this means. One word in the Lakota language is special to Angelica, the word Laieska. Laieska means an interpreter between two worlds. Sometimes a Laieska translates between the spiritual world and the human world, or a Laieska can communicate between the Lakota world and the settler world. Art can also be a type of Laieska. And so I think that's also something you'll see a lot with Native people and their identities, is this idea of walking in two worlds, being a Native person, living in America when our cultures actually are very different. But it's hard to sort of explain that to people because of how people perceive us as either being sort of assimilated out of existence or, not living our community's values any longer. And so this is very much talking about that split that many of us have because we are walking in two worlds. And here is I wanted to share with you some of images of Angelica in her home landscape so that you can kind of see the connection between the image that she's making and the visuality of the land that she's from, and those layers, the stratification of the rocks, and thinking about her work as a printmaker, which is really cool because she does make very standard two-dimensional prints that you can have framed and put on your wall. But then she also takes these prints and she makes them into sculptural objects. She hangs them from the ceiling. She does things like this where they almost look like, you know, a piece of the landscape themselves. And so it's really interesting to see the many forms in which her works take, and that the print is a Laesca in itself, right? Because it goes from two-dimensional to three-dimensional in her treatment of it. So I love to show this because she's one of my favorite artists, and also one of the most favorite pieces from the show for sure. So this next section is called the Lifeways section of our presentation. And when we say Lifeways, we're talking about the ways in which Indigenous people lived, the things in which we did day to day in order to survive and maintain our communities and our resilience. So these panels didn't have a ton of editing that we did because much of it was pretty straightforward. There were some things that were edited out, maybe that weren't accurate, but for the most part, this was pretty straightforward and it didn't present anything that was completely inflammatory. So, you know, we added a little bit of text to the top of the panels, as you'll see, because I thought it was interesting that the panels abundant resources and trade is very much like how non-native people think about Indigenous people in many ways, is like, oh yeah, we had all this land, we had abundance, you know, but we didn't know what we were doing with it. And then trade is like, yeah, we you know, we have always been people to trade with for all of the visitors to the Pacific Northwest region, including the French fur trappers and many thousands of years before that, Japanese traders as well. So the Kalapuyans and the people of the Pacific Northwest are actually very metropolitan. And so I'll show you some examples of that here in a moment. If I skip to my next. Oh yes, and this is also something that's important when we talk about Lifeways, which is land stewardship. And so part of the panel says, under the Kalapuya stewardship, the Willamette Valley was a carefully managed landscape. And we actually say engineered because many people think because we were part of the hunter-gatherer group that we did not intentionally interact with our environment, and that's wrong. We absolutely managed our landscape in different ways, from the way that we harvested and also the way that we would do controlled burning. And so, you know, while Oregon is wonderful for agriculture, it was also wonderful for more intentional cultivation of the landscape before then, because Oregon is such a bountiful place, and Kalapuyans were very, just like, you know, Indigenous people in the region, very much engaged in the practice of cultivating for the next generation. And so we have a saying in Indigenous culture, which is like, for the next 7 generations. And so when we make decisions, we're thinking about not only ourselves, but those people who will come after us. And so when we manage the landscapes, we're managing those landscapes for the next year, and we're also managing them for our grandchildren. So that is why we say we have been managing the landscape since time immemorial, which means before history, before memory. And so we can debate on how long that actually is, but you know, we have been doing it for a very long time. Here's an image of a controlled burn. And so some of the benefits to a controlled burn would be, you know, enriching the soil. So if you're wanting to make sure that things grow back the next year stronger. You would burn low, sort of like smaller saplings, or you burn the grasses to get rid of insects. All kinds of reasons why you can do this, but it's interesting because it was something that they actually stopped us from doing once Oregon sort of started to become settled. They did not allow the tribes to do controlled burns anymore. And from that, actually Oregon became even more forested, and the like density wise became more forested, but that also sort of increases the issues with wildfires. So part of the controlled burn is getting rid of things like fir saplings. So people may not know this, but fir trees, like other conifers, can actually be poisonous to the plants around them. So if you let firs overtake a place, it basically becomes a fir desert where nothing else grows around it. And so tribes like the Kalapuyans would burn fir saplings each year to ensure that they didn't snuff out all of the other plants around them. So many different reasons, but a lot of different benefits. And actually, in the last decade, the tribes have started to teach firefighters how to do controlled burns so that we can minimize wildfires and get rid of that fuel, basically, that's just sitting there waiting to burn. So it is a great tool for land management and ensuring that we minimize those wildfires in the summer. Another resource that comes from that, actually from enriching the soil, is we harvest the camas. And camas is a very important plant to the Kalapuyans, as well as many other tribes up and down the Pacific Northwest coast. Camas is a beautiful purple plant, and at the very bottom it has a bulb very similar to garlic. And what we would do is harvest it every spring and collect the bulbs and actually roast them over the course of a few days. And the bulbs would go from tasting kind of similar to garlic to tasting like caramelized onions. And so that's how we would prepare them. And so basically, during a certain part of the year, we would leave our winter camp, which would be at Wapato Lake. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that here in a second. But we would then leave our winter camp to go out for a spring harvest for things like camas. And here's a picture of one of our tribal elders actually harvesting camas with her cup and stick. And as you can see in her hand, she has a stick. And when, during tribal times and still now, if you make your cup and stick, it's cut to your height. So you have your own, and then you will have like an actual stick. And then at the very top, you would have like an antler for your handle. And basically the stick just helps you break up the earth so that you can get the bulb out of the earth easy. And so making your own cup and stick is a big part of tradition. And if you're a part of harvesting traditional foods, you got to have one. And so it's neat because in the original panels, there is a depiction of a cup and stick, and we continue to use those today. Another resource that I have mentioned earlier was the oaks. When we talk about the oak savannas in Oregon white oaks in particular was a really important resource for tribes. We would, again, like I said, cultivate these oak savannas throughout the valley, and by cultivating these oaks, we could then, during a specific time of the year, return to the oaks to collect the acorns. And so what we would do is we would actually bury our mortar and pestles underneath the oaks and leave them for the year. And then when we come back, we dig them up and use them to process the nuts each year. So it's really cool when you think about when you see these mortar and pestles in the museum, to think about them actually being buried underground most of the year and only being used briefly before then being returned to the ground. And then thinking about that land-based identity is very much tied to these specific places, obviously, because we would literally leave our tools there and come back for them year after year. And they are, multi-generational tools. So, your mortar and pestle was likely used by your grandmother or your great grandmother. So, these pieces have all kinds of meaning outside of just being tools of harvest. So I love to see this stuff myself. I'm a nerd for that old history stuff. So another plant that is important to us that you likely have seen somewhere because it's all over the place in Oregon is called wapato, or sometimes people pronounce it wapatu, depending on where you are. So wapato or wapatu is a plant that grows sort of on the edges of a body of water, like a lake or like in a wetlands area, and they have this arrow shaped leaf with white flowers, and at the very bottom of it, kind of similar to the camas, is a bulb, but this one is actually like more like a potato. And so wapato actually means like water potato. And so what we would do is when the wapato was ready to be harvested, we would wade into the water and actually use our toes to loosen the bulbs from the mud. And then as they would come out of the mud, they actually rise to the top of the water. And so you can just snatch them off the water. So anyway, this is when you think about harvesting and tradition and, these ways in which we executed our, day-to-day and year-to-year life. These traditions are really important to us, and these plants are really important to us. And as I mentioned, Wapato Lake is actually a very important place to us, and Wapato Lake is in Gaston. As you can see, it doesn't really look like a lake right now, and that's because it was a lake, but when Oregon was being settled and you had like the land of the land claims, everyone was getting their 40 acres and a mule. This land was actually turned into agricultural land. The lake was filled in order to have it be a place that could be cultivated for food and whatnot. So unfortunately, this very special place that we used to stay over winter and live, unfortunately just, got turned into something completely different for, many generations. What's cool about Lake Wapato now is that the federal government is actually working with the tribes to restore Lake Wapato. So it's really neat to see the community as well as the government coming together to take these places and return them to their original beauty and create habitat for animals and for birds to come back again. So it's really exciting to see these landscape restorations, especially after agriculture has really changed the face of Oregon in many ways. So let me skip on here. Another special resource, I'm sure you're not surprised by this, is red cedar and yellow cedar as well, but red cedars obviously have a special place in Pacific Northwest indigenous life. The bark of the red cedar is very special because it's super straight, and you can use it to make all kinds of things, from baskets to we used it to make different boxes to store our blankets in over the winter, because cedar is anti-insect, and so there's all kinds of uses for cedar. I actually have, this is my cedar hat here, and there we go. And actually, this is red cedar as well, but it's been dyed purple. And this is a similar shape to most Pacific Northwest tribes along the coast. You'll see is this sort of cone-shaped hat that we all wore. Also functions great as a basket. But what's cool about cedar is it's really resilient, and you can use it to make rope if you want. So aside from, the tribes along the coast that use it to make canoes and longhouses, and I'll show you actually one of our longhouses or Bull House. These are places that now would be more of a ceremonial location, but would have in the past, prior to contact, been home for many generations and maybe multiple family units. So and these things are huge. They're like 3 school buses long at least. This is the inside of one that's from the Chinook Nation. This is one of theirs. And this pull house is now, again, used mainly for ceremony. If you were in a pull house, you know, before contact, you would have partitions in here so that, you know, each family group could have a little bit more privacy. Obviously, there would have been different furniture in here, but what would have been the same is the central hearths that you see, where actually we would, you know, have fires built for cooking and for warmth. And as you can imagine, this would be a really great place to overwinter in, because it's very sturdy and is going to protect you from, you know, the harshest elements of Oregon's winter at that time, which at Wapato Lake would not have been that bad, but definitely is the better option if you're going to be living in a tribal community than, say, like a teepee. So this is, for the winter time, the best option for Indigenous people, because you can keep a bunch of people warm, tons of storage, and protect yourself from the harsh elements that are, you know, that are more unpredictable in winter. One of the other resources that were really important to our tribe and actually was used as kind of like currency is called dentalium, and it is a shell that is not actually from Oregon. It comes all the way from British Columbia, up in a very specific location, and these shells are actually still very expensive, and also represent a certain status in Indigenous communities. As you can see in this picture, this young lady has a lot of dentalium. So if we saw her in our community, we'd be like, that girl is rich. So I love seeing those old images. Dentalium is much harder to come by nowadays, but I actually have a dentalium medallion, and it's obviously of a hand, but we still find these objects to be very important, and we wear them in our traditional regalias, and you know, a lot of our bead workers use them in their jewelry. As you can see, there's a picture here with a very small beaded necklace with it's actually got a bear paw on the front of it, and that's made by my Aunt Carol, and she is just an amazing bead worker who is a cultural teacher within the Grande Ronde tribe as well, and still we carry on these traditions now still today. Oh, this is a great example when I was talking earlier about the idea of the Kalapuyan people being metropolitan. So in this image, you may not know just by looking at it, but this man is wearing some objects from very different places. And so you can start just by looking at his shoes and see they look very European. And it is likely that he would have traded with a fur trapper from Canada, maybe somebody from the Hudson Bay Company, you know, for those shoes. That's definitely not a style that we would have worn traditionally. He's also wearing a seal quiver for his bow and arrows. And obviously seals don't exist in the Willamette Valley, so likely he traded that, you know, for that seal quiver with somebody from the actual coast, or maybe a Chinookan tribe up in the Columbia River area where the seals would come a little bit inland, but definitely not something that we would have had in the Kalapuyan regions. He's also wearing what basically is described as like an elk cape. And we did not hunt elk. Elk would not necessarily have been something that the valley has a lot of. So likely he would have traded with a tribe from maybe downriver or across the river, but definitely not elk, or not something that we would have hunted traditionally in Kalapuyan, you know, in the year of our seasons. So elk would have been something we would have had to trade for. So it's kind of cool. It gives you an idea that, you know, obviously we're interacting with people from all over the place, and that, you know, we weren't just some isolated group of people living in the woods, you know. All right. And so takes me to my next art piece that I wanted to share with you. And this is a cow skull that is painted in the colors of a salmon by Modoc artist Derek Lavore. And he was trying to express this, which is similar to the idea that Angelica was talking about, this Laesca. And Derek was talking about the sort of split between his heritage and his other family members who depend on cattle ranching. So let me read you his quote. It says, "One side of my family relied on work from the farms, and the other side are members of the Klamath tribe. I understand the agony of both sides over dam removal." And so I think that a lot of Native people, again, this idea of walking in two worlds comes up in our work, where we can see both sides because we have family, or we ourselves are working in jobs that maybe are in conflict with our heritage in some way. And this idea that we can recognize that the world is as it is, how dam removal would impact certain people, but also be beneficial to some people, and that conflict is very real for many of us. And so I love the way that this piece embodies that with the cow skull, and then the trout or the salmon painted over the top of it. It really speaks to that conflict of land and water, which is, again, goes back to the resources and how important those things are to Indigenous people. All right, so some of the panels that I had to edit were a little bit more intense and more historically heavy in terms of what was included in them. These panels talk a lot about the treaties, and I actually wrote broken over the word treaties, as you can see in the second panel. And basically just talking, these panels talk a lot about how, how we were treated in that process of determining where a reservation would be. And it's kind of hard to see here, but in the middle of that panel, you can see there's like a tiny little square. And that's actually where Wapato Lake is. And that's where we wanted our reservation to be, because that's where, our pull houses were. That's where a real, true, foundational infrastructure was. And so that's where we wanted to be. Unfortunately, that was not what was agreed upon. And we were, given the Grande Ronde reservation as our location. Unfortunately, Grande Ronde is actually very isolated and doesn't have super close access to water. There weren't any roads there when we were sent there. It was pretty much just in the middle of the woods. So, and it wasn't a place that any of the tribes had ever lived. So it was completely foreign landscape to them, essentially. So when we think about the treaties, they are painful for us because I would call that, it's like coercion when you make people sign these agreements under duress when they've experienced brutal, violence against themselves or their family members. So these treaties, unfortunately, weren't really honored. And many of the things that were agreed eventually in the treaties were upended within a matter of, 30 to 50 years, essentially. Another set of the panels that were in this exhibition originally was this timeline set, and much of the original timeline that the museum created was about Oregon settler history. It was really weird. I actually covered up multiple events on this timeline because it was like, oh, first settlers arrive in Oregon. It was very much about the Oregon Trail, basically. And that was just bizarre to me because this is supposed to be about Indigenous people, and it really doesn't prioritize Indigenous people's perspective. And so this timeline I went through with a fine-tooth comb with my tribal scholar, David Lewis, and to really reprioritize and also bring forth some important events in our tribal history and what we went through and what we experienced. And also some of these events just didn't have any context, so people didn't really know this was actually a really painful event, that did damage to our community, as opposed to just listing it as something that happened. Here's a zoom in on some of the more painful events that happen. I highly suggest if you want to look at these, go to the exhibition and see. But basically, reprioritizing information, showing when we were terminated by the government, when they said, you're not Indians anymore. You're just going to be American citizens, and you need to assimilate. And then, also that meant dissolving all of the reservations and taking our land. And then, us having to then fight for decades after that to recover our rights, to be seen as a sovereign nation, and to have tribal sovereignty took a long time to recover after all of the reservation stuff was said and done. So there's a lot of painful history, but there's also a lot of really proud history on here too, like creating our own tribal constitution and establishing our own sovereign government. So those things were added to make sure that people knew that, that our journey didn't just end in pain, and that we continue, and that we're still here and doing work for our community, but also for the broader community. So you should also know that the Kalapuyan language is essentially lost. There is the Tualatin, the last speaker of Tualatin Kalapuya was Louis Canoyer, and so we have like some recordings of him, and we have some writings, but we don't actually have a full account of the Kalapuyan language, and we do have a full account of the Santiam, from what I understand. But what people don't realize is that during those times where people were being forced in the reservation, we lost a lot of people. We lost people who carried our cultural knowledge, and over just a few generations of people being on the reservation, many people were lost that carried those traditions with them, and so because of that, we've had to do a lot of work to recover what we could. And so one of the things that we lost was the Kalapuyan language. And so the Grande Ronde speaks something called Chinook Wawa, which is, not the language of all tribes in the Grande Ronde, but many tribes lost their language. So we have invested a lot of time in retaining Chinook Wawa. All right, so one of the more painful panels that I had to edit was the family separation panels. And these panels talk about the Indian school that was located in Forest Grove originally. And these schools were built to essentially assimilate Native children into, capitalist life, to be contributors to white society, essentially. And so these children were taken from their homes on the reservation, from their Native families, and they were given new names, new Christian names, and they were also had all of their hair cut off and forced to basically, wear different clothes and become different people. Some children died. Many of these Indian schools across the country and also across Canada have mass graves, including Salem. So this school was originally built in Forest Grove, and it was moved to Salem about 4 years later. Chemawa, which still exists and is open today in Salem. And these schools have a great deal of pain associated with them. The children who went through these schools have an immense amount of trauma that unfortunately they carried with them, and also then, got passed down to their descendants as well. So these pictures are actually like looking at family members that I know were abducted. And so the way that the museum presented these images does not give any context for that. And actually, let me show you this next picture here. The images that were taken of these children were actually used to raise money and show how the U.S. government was successfully making the Indian into a man, or making them, civilized, as it were. So you might notice also between the first picture where they arrived at the school and this second picture, which was just about a few months later, 7 months later, a child is missing. So in between the first and second picture, a child had died already. Yeah, you can see that dressing has changed, their hair has changed, the little boys are dressed in military outfits, so you can see this intentional aesthetic change that has been placed upon them. And this was very painful, and again, had ramifications on my own family. My grandmother went to one of these schools, and you should also, I don't know how close you pay attention to this, but just last week, Harvard released a statement saying that they have over 700 Indigenous children's hair clippings in their archives from this time. And this was a time of eugenics as well. So these children were seen as something to be experimented on as well, because they had been dehumanized essentially. So these things are very painful, and the museum didn't really present them honestly. And so that was a big part of the edits that were made to these panels, is to clarify what exactly people were looking at when they looked at these images. So this is my last slide, because obviously the slide before this was kind of sad. But what I will say is that through all of these things that our community has experienced, we now are a sovereign nation, and we govern ourselves, and we have done amazing things in spite of our history, and that Grande Ronde is continuing to enrich its community, and also enrich the broader community with things like the Spirit Mountain Community Fund, and their recent purchase, and also plans to rehabilitate Willamette Falls. So I'm very proud of my tribe and the things that we are doing today, and also the things that we've overcome. And I just hope that when you think of the land that you're on, you'll remember that it has a very complex history, and that the people who experience that history, their descendants remain, and that we are here caring for the land, and that we're your friends and your neighbors. So I will leave it at that. And then I went so fast, I didn't even think about looking at questions. So I don't know if there are any yet, but anyway, I will be quiet and we can do that.
Well, this is a good opportunity. Thank you, Steph. This is a good opportunity to remind folks that if you have any questions or comments, please pop them in the chat box, and we'll get to them. Lots of things are just running through my head, and this is I've spent a lot of time thinking about this exhibit and your participation in it. And the one thing that really stands out to me, and this is just kind of the very first thing, is that your involvement was a real act of reclamation. And that's a brave act, because especially when that reclamation is directed at a non-Indigenous institution, right, which has its own kind of cultural marker, right? Can you talk a little bit about that process of reclaiming your story?
Yeah, I think that's actually something that is really important, because natives have not really been allowed to tell our story for many generations. We have been excluded from being the teller of our stories. So even in the case of this exhibition, right, it was created by anthropologists and people who worked at a museum who actually didn't know anything about us as a community. They just wanted to make something about natives, basically, and their distance from the community was very apparent in the way that they approached the making of it. And so for me to be able to go and correct some of those errors and really like reframe things is like, it's just something that we have had to do in many ways for generations, is to like try to make space for our perspective, because unfortunately we're not seen as an authority on ourselves, right? So anthropologists don't believe our myths as being accurate representations of history. So a perfect example is many Pacific Northwest tribes have stories about the Missoula floods. So if we have stories about the Missoula floods, one might posit that we existed before the Missoula floods, and that actually we would have had to exist for a while if we had, spoken and tradition, like a oral traditions passing it down. But that's not in line with what archaeology wants to sort of say about the development of North America. And when the original panels were created, they said we only existed in America for like 9,000 years. That's what the panel said. But actually, just in the last like 6 months, science has come out and caught up with native knowledge and said, oh, actually, humans have been on the North American continent for at least 20,000 years. So in the time in between the panels being made and now, science has had to change its perspective already. So that's further proof that it's important to include the perspective of the people you're talking about.
Right. Yay, science. Congratulations, right?
At least they're catching up,
Yeah. Excuse me. Here's the coughing. I recently reread a really great book by Daniel Heath Justice called Why Indigenous Literatures Matter. And he talks about stories. And he talks about how so many of the stories that Indigenous people consume are from someone else. And you alluded to that earlier, right? That you're not experts of your own lived experience, right? and he talks about how they're toxic, and they manifest themselves in this, what he calls a story of indigenous deficiency, right? And they become internalized. And I'm wondering if, as you went through and you're looking at these panels and you're reclaiming these stories, what was it like to think about, or if you did, the generations of indigenous deficiency that has been really consumed, not necessarily by these panels, but by this information?
Yeah, I think, really a lot of that is tied to white supremacy. And it actually is a formula that's used not just on Indigenous people, but actually on many marginalized people, which is to say, you're not the authority on your experience, and that whatever you perceive of your experience isn't true. And so that is basically like gaslighting. That's like narcissistic abuse, essentially, if you were in, say, a personal relationship. But to have that be a systemic way that we are approached as a people is actually like really damaging to our own identity. And it's something that I think many of us actually deal with personally, to be like, am I the right person to be talking about this? Because there's an imposter syndrome that goes along with being told for generations that we don't know what we're talking about, and that we were just savage people who desperately needed to be colonized, And so overcoming those perspectives to show that actually our community was very resilient, and also knew so much about the land and about cosmology and things of that nature that we just aren't given credit for, because it doesn't fit the narrative of manifest destiny and that sort of thing.
Right. And he, just to mention that book one more time, he talks about how those stories, and again, it's kind of an act of reclamation, right? It's when you reclaim those stories, there's an element of subversiveness about it that is almost lost because they're dealing with contexts that are not apparent to people on the outside, and that's where the power is. And one of the things I appreciated about his book, and especially at the very end, was flipping that narrative and making it be more about assets based rather than deficiency based. And that's a huge shift.
Absolutely. I would say that that whole, when you said that deficiency thing, it made me think about all the ways in which people interact with me, as a professional artist, and how, it's like, people assume that I don't have what's necessary to do things because of me being an Indigenous artist. So,
Hmm.
even the way that clients will approach me sometimes, it's like, oh, you must be desperate for work, and so it's really interesting to be interacting with people and to have them assume that just because I'm a Native person that I must need a job really bad or something. And so it's like, you have an assumption about our community and the people that come from it that is based in stereotype,
Right.
and that's something that we have to combat. And that reclamation is part of that, like, upending of those perspectives that are basically go unquestioned for generations, right? And we have to come in and say, no, this is not true. And but then we also have to prove it because people haven't believed us for so long.
Right.
So I think that's actually what's cool about the exhibition and the in the panels specifically is that, when I talked about them asking me to come in and look at them and say, do we just throw these in the garbage? Like, are they that bad? And yes, they are that bad, but what good is it to erase your mistakes without admitting your mistakes? Because
Right.
we trust institutions, particularly history institutions. When people go into a museum, they're like, all of this must be true,
Hmm.
and to be able to go in and hand correct something that was written by an anthropologist, one, gives me way more agency than I've ever had as an
Hmm.
Indigenous woman, and also shows their weakness and bias just plain as day in a way that you would never know if they had just made a brand new exhibition. And
Right.
so it teaches you about the history, but it also teaches you about the ways in which the history has been misinterpreted or mischaracterized.
Right. Right. And I will say that I think one of that transformation from Washington County Museum to Five Oaks, I think has been just wonderful. And I think that their shift in perspective has been really pretty remarkable. And it is, I think, a credit to their ability to kind of reclaim what it means to be an institution with, the ability to reflect, right, on stuff that just ordinarily, they put up and wouldn't think too much about.
Yeah, or
Uh,
their power, like how
yeah,
they wield it, right?
exactly. And that institutional power is pretty significant.
Yes. Even for that little tiny Five
I
Oaks
know.
museum.
I know. Um, I've got a couple questions. Jill says, I can see Wapato Lake from my house, and I'm wondering if the Kalapuya lived on all sides of the lake or just to the west, where I know artifacts have been found.
Yeah, I would have to ask. I have my friend is also the tribal cultural resource manager, so he would likely know where we would. But I think west would make most sense just in terms of the way the sun rises and things like that. But I would know that we would have used the entirety of that area anyway, just because that's where our overwinter camp was. So it's a very significant place, but also hard to sort of think of it as it was because it's so different now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jill, for asking. Another question. Excuse me. And I think maybe I've touched on this, but if there's maybe a little more you can add to it, is just talking about your personal experience reworking this exhibit.
Yeah, I mean, I should. This is a funny thing, which is that I actually took all of those panels home in my car, my Subaru. I put them in the back, and I brought them home with me. And I basically lived with those panels for about a month, and would set them out in my studio and just read them and look at the language and think about the language because it's so much information that it really like takes time to go through critically and not like skip over the subtle language shifts. And so it really did take like me just literally living with the exhibition and examining it really in depth in a way that obviously hadn't been done before. So yeah, I mean, it was very personal for me, and it's personal for me because I know that these stories haven't been told and that it's important for them to be told, especially the Indian boarding school stuff because for those people who don't know, Deb Haaland is one of the very first Indigenous woman to be appointed to the Department of the Interior, and she is actually on her own inquest about these schools across the U.S. But Canada has already been in an inquest on these schools for years now, and just in the last couple of years, the amount of children's bodies that have been found across Canada is in the thousands, nearly 10,000 at this point. So it does show you there was a widespread system of unfortunately child abuse and in many cases death. And so it's important for people to remember this stuff, because we're in a very polarized time where people find it easy to be mean or dehumanize each other, and that's a slippery slope. And it's a slippery slope to think that you can just write off an entire group of people. And so that's why it's important for me to share this stuff too, is because it's not just about Native history, it's about everyone recognizing that we have to get along, otherwise we do really terrible shit to each other. So we have to remember these histories so that we don't repeat them.
All right. Well, and I think you talk about the perception of Indigenous people as being somehow tied exclusively to the past, and that that there is this, like, they're removed from contemporaneity, right? They don't live among us, right? But when you mention Canada, I think there's just such a different relationship in Canada with questions of indigeneity that they haven't really quite figured out, right? But the example that I think of is the missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is in a way kind of a continuation of this problem that was never resolved. It's just moved to a different sphere, right? But Canada has gone through some tremendous growing pains to resolve some of these issues, not entirely successfully. I mean, do we need a truth and reconciliation effort in the United States? What is it going to take?
Yeah, I think, well, here's the thing is I've thought about this question quite a bit, because I mean, I think of Canada's Indigenous communities as having much more visibility than America's Indigenous communities. But I also think that is, again, tied to white supremacy and thinking about, well, actually, the U.S. government has never admitted or acknowledged the genocide of Indigenous people. They have acknowledged the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, and they will acknowledge every other genocide outside of the bounds of its own country. And because of that, it is very difficult to have truth and reconciliation when you won't even acknowledge the very basis of this idea, which is that, intentional genocide occurred, and in many different ways it occurred. And so until the country is ready to deal with that history, which unfortunately it's not even able to deal with slavery, it's going to have a hard time dealing with all of these things unless we are ready to be honest with ourselves about those things and about our history. And right now, we're sort of split on how we go about that.
Right. And that that split has just become, it's a canyon right now.
Yes.
In terms of something like this becomes politicized, and then it becomes, you can't touch it. But you're absolutely right. This inability to even acknowledge, the fundamental fact of widespread genocide of thousands and thousands of people, I think it's that's the truth piece that's missing, right? You can't get to reconciliation until you get to the truth piece.
That part.
Yeah. So you talked about when you were growing up and not seeing yourself represented, and then having the ability to come in and reclaim that story, right? And I'm wondering, have you had any contact with school kids or other young people who are beginning to see themselves represented, and what has that impact been like for them?
You know what? I am so honored to be the person I am today because I grew up without representation. Really, like the only representation of Indigenous women that I saw was like Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves. You know,
Yeah.
so like in terms of Indigenous depiction, I didn't really have a whole lot to work with, and so for me, um, not seeing myself in the world actually like was really difficult for a long time. And then I realized my purpose as an artist was to bring those things into the world that I needed so desperately, because I realized that um my relatives, my nieces and nephews and extended family, that they need that representation now. And so, as you mentioned in the beginning, I just finished and I'm getting ready for my very first fully illustrated book to come out. It was in collaboration with the author Carol Lindstrom, who she wrote "We Are Water Protectors," which was a big children's book. Yes,
I love
so
this book. I love it.
it's a great one. And we worked on her one of her next books, which comes out in March, and it's called My Powerful Hair. And it's actually about the granddaughter of a boarding school survivor and how she learns the power of her hair and why her hair is so important. And if you remember how I mentioned that Harvard has 700
Mm,
clippings of our hair and how they made us cut our hair, that is all connected in this way of like, we have always been too wild or unrefined and not human enough, essentially. And so making books that show us in a positive way, or illustrations that reflect the beauty of our community, is like the most rewarding and amazing thing that I could be doing with my time. And so I'm just so proud to be in a position to do that now, to have been the person that needed it, but also now have this opportunity to create the thing that is needed. And so I also just feel so honored to be in this time because there are so many Indigenous artists contemporaries who are doing the same thing. And so
mhm,
it's a really cool time to be a Native artist because there are so many of us contributing to that filling of that gap.
mhm. Well, I look forward to that. You said it was coming out in March,
Yes, it comes out in March. It's on Amazon now for pre-order. It's called My Powerful Hair if you want to go look at some of the interior artwork on it.
and be sure to stop by your local library and check it
Yes.
out because we'll have it. Um, great. So for folks who are planning to visit the exhibit at Pacific, they're going to be taking in kind of the panorama of those panorama of panels. Um, what would you I don't want you to necessarily tell someone what they need to take away from that, but I mean, what would be something that you would suggest, um, noting that they might not that might sort of pass them by, or something that really stands out to you that is special that you would want to have someone else kind of take note of?
Well, I think what's significant about this exhibition being at Pacific University is that that is very close to where the Indian boarding school was. Like it
Mhm.
literally is like right there. They're essentially right in the same area. So thinking about while you're in that library looking at that exhibition, that those things that are being talked about actually happened right there, and that this is truly local history. This isn't like some abstract thing that happened in some faraway place. It happened on the ground that you're standing. And so,
Mhm.
thinking about people who do the whole land acknowledgement stuff, I ask people to do a land commitment instead. And what that to me means is that everyone has different levels of commitment that they can make, but everyone can probably commit to learning more about the original stewards of the land that they're on and the tribal people that continue to be stewards of the land that they're on, because likely there are some. So,
Mhm.
I really just encourage people to like go out and seek that information, because I think that it helps you to know your environment better, and also just like empathize better with people, because our world is so diverse and there's so many different experiences. And when we learn about each other, I feel like we're better for it, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think it's also a good reminder that, we set aside a month, but this is a 365/6 day a year ongoing commitment to become more informed, and to do that work ourselves, right? To take that effort and begin that learning journey ourselves, to be curious, and I love how you talk about being empathetic, right?
Yeah.
To approach it with an open mind and open heart, and be willing to learn and go where that journey takes you. So,
Yeah.
and I
It doesn't
appreciate you.
I was going to say it just
I'm
doesn't,
sorry,
it
go ahead.
doesn't have to be people kind of get defensive, I think, about history, and that's why I like to teach it, is because it's important for us to know this stuff, but it's also like important for us to connect and empathize with each other and not be like,
Mhm.
I'm mad at you because your ancestors did this. It's more like, hey, this stuff happened and we have to learn together so that we don't do it again, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I really appreciate you taking time out this evening to help generate interest and stimulate that curiosity about taking that learning journey. And I hope that folks who were here tonight, I assume that everybody who joined us is already kind of curious to begin with, right? Um, and that that they can take that next step in whatever that journey is. So, Steph, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and being a part of the small way that we honor Indigenous peoples in our community, and acknowledge that past, the present, and the future. So I really appreciate that.
My pleasure, really, honestly. I appreciate the time, and thank you to everyone who stayed to listen.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all, everybody. Steph, I'll meet you in the breakout room when we're
Okay.
done. We'll just chat a little bit. But thanks, everybody. And if you have, please stop by the library's website, check out our event calendar. We're gradually moving back into doing in-person stuff. We're still in that kind of nebulous area. We'll continue to offer online things, but check out our schedule, and also be sure to follow us on Facebook. So until next time, everybody, be safe and take care.